The monitor's reflection illuminated Gabriella's tired face as she put the cleaning products in the cart. His brown eyes scanned the digital clock in the corner of the screen. 11:50 p.m. It was time for her secret ritual, those precious 10 minutes that kept her sane during long nights of work on the 40th floor of the Kingston Tower, in the heart of Chicago. His fingers brushed against the old ballet slipper hanging in his bag, a constant reminder of what he had lost. 18 months ago, a torn knee ligament during a performance of Swan Lake had abruptly ended his promising career with Chicago City Ballet. The same injury that shattered her dreams now forced her to clean offices to ensure her younger brother, Miguel, could continue on to medical school. Gabriella removed her work shoes and slipped the worn flats onto her feet, a ritual that made her heart race with anticipation. The sprawling executive office space, with its polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, transformed into his private stage every night. 40 floors above, Daniel Kingston watched his reflection in the panoramic window of his executive penthouse. By the age of 35, he had built a real estate empire that made Kingston Tower seem small by comparison. But success had its price. His serious expression and impeccable suit hid a man who had forgotten how to smile since his parents died in a helicopter crash 5 years ago. The soft sound of classical music wafting through the ventilation system caught his attention. It was her again, the mysterious night dancer who had become his silent obsession over the past few weeks. Daniel approached the window, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the floor below, where a lone figure began to move with a grace that left him breathless. Gabriella closed her eyes, letting Tchaikovsky's music guide her. His movements were precise, years of training burned into his muscle memory. Her knee protested slightly, but she ignored the pain. In those moments, she was no longer a cleaning lady. She was a prima ballerina again, her dreams still intact. "Mr. Kingston?" The voice of Lawrence, his personal assistant, interrupted the moment. "The merger contracts with West Coast Development need your signature by early tomorrow." Daniel reluctantly turned away from the window. "Leave it on my desk, Lawrence, and you can go home." "Shouldn't you do the same? It's almost midnight." Daniel just shook his head, his eyes involuntarily returning to the dancer below. Lawrence followed his gaze, but all he saw was the reflection of the city lights. On the lower level, Gabriella performed a sequence of pirouettes, her body moving like water. A lone tear ran down her face as she completed the choreography. Reality awaited her. 4 more hours of work, then the subway to her small apartment in Logan Square, where she would share a hasty breakfast with Miguel before he rushed to his classes. Daniel watched as she put away her flats and resumed her work uniform. Something about that dance touched him deeply, reminding him of a time when he also knew what it was like to have a passion for something other than spreadsheets and contracts. An impulsive decision began to form in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed Human Resources, leaving a voicemail message. "I need the complete file on the 40th floor night shift cleaner, first thing tomorrow." Gabriella finished her shift at 4 a.m., having no idea her life was about to change. As he walked through the building's empty lobby, the night guard, Jerry, waved as usual. "Good evening, Miss Moreno. Or would it be good morning?" She smiled, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "Good night, Jerry. Take care of yourself." The cold Chicago wind greeted her outside, carrying promises of snow. Gabriella pulled her coat tighter around her, her thoughts already on the next day, the next shift, the next 10 minutes of freedom she could steal for herself. At the top of Kingston Tower, Daniel remained in his office long after the city's lights began to go out. His fingers drummed restlessly on the mahogany table as his mind replayed the dance he had just witnessed. For the first time in years, he felt something awaken in his chest. A curiosity, a desire to know the story behind that lone dancer who turned his building into a stage every night. As the first snow of winter began to fall on Chicago, 2 lonely hearts went their separate ways, unaware that fate had already begun to weave its threads, intertwining their lives in ways neither could predict. The rising sun painted the horizon pink when Gabriella finally arrived home. Miguel slept on the couch, surrounded by anatomy books, and she covered him with a blanket before going to his room. Her flats, kept lovingly in her bag, felt lighter that morning, as if they shared a secret that only they knew. The next morning, Daniel Kingston found himself restless in his Italian leather chair, his eyes fixed on Gabriela Moreno's personal file that had just arrived on his desk. The photo attached to the document showed a young, vibrant face, with eyes that seemed to hold a much larger story than their current position suggested. "Lawrence, cancel my appointments this afternoon," he ordered over the intercom, his voice softer than usual. The assistant, accustomed to his boss's methodical coolness, noticed the subtle change in tone. "Sir, the meeting with the Japanese investors—" Lawrence began to protest. "Reschedule." The word came out like a definitive order. Daniel closed the file and stood up, walking to the window that the night before had served as his private screen for that secret performance. A quick online search revealed more about Gabriela than just her corporate file. Old Chicago Tribune articles highlighted her promising ballet career, photos of past performances, and finally, news of the accident that ended it all. The contrast between the dancer gracefully captured on stage and the night cleaning worker was achingly poetic. Meanwhile, in a small cafe in Logan Square, Gabriela watched Miguel devour a muffin while reviewing his anatomy notes. Her brother had insisted on joining her for breakfast, worried about her deepening dark circles. "Gabi, you can't go on like this," Miguel said, closing his book. "This job is killing you." She smiled, a gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "It's temporary, hermano. 2 more years and you'll be Dr. Moreno, remember? And by then you will have completely given up on your own dreams?" The question hit Gabriela like a punch in the stomach. His fingers instinctively touched the troublesome knee under the table. Back at Kingston Tower, Daniel surprised himself by organizing a surprise visit to the lower floors, something he has never done. His heart quickened when the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor. During the day, the space was occupied by executives in expensive suits, completely different from the magical atmosphere I witnessed every night. "Mr. Kingston?" The floor supervisor almost dropped her clipboard when she saw him. "We weren't expecting your visit." "Just a routine inspection," he lied softly, his eyes scanning the space where, hours before, Gabriela had danced. "How's the nightly cleaning service?" "Excellent, sir, especially since we hired Miss Moreno. She takes special care with details." Daniel nodded, wondering if the supervisor had any idea of her employee's hidden talent. "I'd like to see her performance reports." That afternoon, Gabriela slept restlessly in her modest apartment, preparing for another night of work. Her dreams were always the same. She was back on stage, playing the lead role in Giselle, but at the moment of the grand jeté, her knee gave way, and she fell into the void. She woke up with a start to the ringing of her cell phone. It was a message from Kingston Tower's Human Resources Department, requesting his presence an hour before his shift for an important meeting. His stomach clenched with anxiety. Meetings rarely meant good news for cleaning staff. What Gabriela didn't know was that, at the same moment, Daniel was in his office planning something that would change the course of their lives. After hours of research, he had discovered that the Chicago City Ballet was preparing a new production, adapted especially for dancers who had suffered serious injuries. "Lawrence," called his assistant, "contact Richard Maxwell of Chicago City Ballet. Tell him Kingston Enterprises is interested in a philanthropic partnership." Night was falling over Chicago when Gabriela walked through the revolving doors of the Kingston Tower, her work uniform neatly folded in her bag along with her flats. Jerry, the night guard, noticed your early arrival. "How are you, Miss Moreno? It's very early today." "Meeting with HR," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you know what this is about?" Jerry shook his head, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. You're our best employee." In the elevator, Gabriela allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. The flats in her bag felt like they weighed a ton. Was it her 10 minutes of dreaming every night that had gotten her into trouble? What she didn't know was that, 40 floors up, Daniel Kingston was having his own internal battle. For the first time in years, he was about to do something completely impulsive, something that wasn't in the meticulous plans that had built his empire. The city glowed through the windows as night settled in, transforming Chicago into a sea of lights that resembled fallen stars. Somewhere between the 40th floor and the executive penthouse, two destinies were about to intertwine in a way neither could have predicted. The clock said 7:45 p.m. when the elevator doors opened on the human resources floor. Gabriella adjusted the necklace on her simple dress, a piece she saved for special occasions, and walked towards the reception, unaware that her life was about to take a turn, as dramatic as the pirouettes she performed in secret every night. Gabriella's heart hammered against her chest as the secretary led her not to the common HR meeting room, but to the executive elevator. "Mr. Kingston is waiting for you in his office," the woman informed him with an enigmatic smile. 40 floors has never felt so long. Gabriella watched the luminous numbers increase, her hands nervously gripping the strap of the bag where her flats rested. Was it possible that someone had discovered her dancing? The idea made his stomach turn. The doors opened directly into the penthouse office, revealing a stunning view of Chicago that made Gabriella catch her breath. Daniel Kingston was standing at the window, the same window he watched her through every night, although she didn't know it. "Miss Moreno." His voice was softer than the rumors suggested. "Please sit down." Daniel turned to face her, and something in his gaze made Gabriella freeze. There was a familiarity there, as if he already knew her. She settled into the designated chair, trying to maintain her composure. "I imagine you're wondering why you're here," he began, sitting down in his own chair. "I have watched your work with great interest." Gabriella's stomach knotted. So that was it. He knew about her nightly dances. "Mr. Kingston, I can explain," she began, but he raised a hand, gently interrupting her. "There's nothing to explain, Miss Moreno. Or should I say, prima ballerina of the Chicago City Ballet." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her blush. "Former ballerina," she corrected, automatically touching her knee. "That was in another life." Daniel leaned forward, his fingers drumming softly on the table. "What if I told you that this other life doesn't have to be over?" He slid an envelope across the table. Inside, Gabriella found a flyer from the Chicago City Ballet advertising a new rehabilitation program for injured dancers, along with an official letter offering her a spot. His voice trailed off as his eyes scanned the documents. "Kingston Enterprises just became the main sponsor of this program," Daniel explained, his voice betraying an emotion that surprised even himself. "And yes, I have watched your nightly dances, every single one." The blush on Gabriella's cheeks intensified. "So every night when yes, from my office, through the reflection in the windows." Daniel stood up, walking towards her. "You turned this place into something magical, Miss Moreno. Something that made me realize how much time I spent just existing, without actually living." Tears began to form in Gabriella's eyes. "Why are you doing this for me?" Daniel stopped, considering the question. Why, indeed? He himself wasn't sure. Maybe because seeing you dance reminded me that there is still beauty in the world, that some dreams deserve a second chance. "But my brother," Gabriella began, thinking about Miguel and college fees. "Your scholarship in the program will include a stipend," Daniel anticipated her concern. "Enough to keep your brother in medical school." Gabriella stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The city glowed below, the same view that had witnessed their secret dances. "What if I can't do it? What if my knee can't handle it?" Daniel approached, stopping beside her. "Then you will have tried. Isn't it better than wondering, what if, for the rest of your life?" The silence between them was filled with unspoken possibilities. Gabriella turned to face him, noticing for the first time how blue his eyes were, and how they seemed less cold than the rumors suggested. "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Kingston?" Daniel hesitated, surprising himself at his own honesty when he replied, "Because your dances are the only thing that's made me feel anything real in years." The moment was interrupted by the intercom. Mr. Kingston, the merger documents have just arrived, Lawrence announced. Thank you, Gabriella said softly, holding the envelope to her chest. I don't know how to thank you. Dance, Daniel replied simply. That's all I ask in return. When Gabriella left the office, Daniel remained at the window, watching the city. For the first time in years, a genuine smile played on his lips. In the elevator, Gabriella opened her bag and touched her worn flats, thinking about how those stolen 10 minutes every night had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. That night, when she danced on the 40th floor, she did so knowing she was being watched. His movements were a mixture of gratitude and promise, dedicated to the man who had returned his dreams. And 40 floors up, Daniel Kingston watched, realizing that perhaps he too was beginning to dream again. The Chicago City Ballet Rehab Program apartment was modest, but to Gabriella it felt like a palace compared to her old address in Logan Square. Sitting on the small sofa, she watched Miguel unpack his medical books, a wide smile on his young face. I still can't believe you're going to dance again, Gabby, he said, stopping to examine a framed photo of them with his parents. Mommy and Daddy would be so proud. The mention of her parents made Gabriella's heart sink. The car accident that took them 5 years ago still hurt like an open wound. They always said dancing was my soul, she murmured, unconsciously touching her knee. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Claire Matthews, the show's physical therapist, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and steely determination. Ready to get started, Gabriella? The first physical therapy session was a painful reminder of how much work lay ahead. Each exercise seemed to awaken long, dormant muscles, and the knee protested with each movement. Claire watched intently, taking notes on her clipboard. You have an excellent technical foundation, Claire commented, adjusting Gabriella's position. And most importantly, you have the right motivation. But I need you to be honest about your limits. On the other side of town, Daniel Kingston found himself distracted during a council meeting. His thoughts kept returning to the dancer who had captured his attention so unexpectedly. Lawrence noticed his boss discreetly checking his cell phone several times. Mr. Kingston, one of the directors called, bringing Daniel back to the present. About investing in the ballet program. It's not up for discussion, Daniel cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. Kingston Enterprises has been committed to the arts for generations. My mother... He stopped abruptly. Amanda Kingston had been a passionate patron of the arts, always insisting that her only son needed more than numbers and contracts in his life. The accident that took her, along with her father, had buried that part of him. Until now. Back at the dance studio, Gabriella faced her reflection in the mirror for the first time in 18 months. Claire had insisted that she start with basic bar exercises, but even these simple movements reminded her body of what it was capable of. Remember, Claire instructed, we're not trying to get back to exactly what you were before. We're building something new, something stronger. The words echoed in Gabriella's mind as she performed a basic plie. Her reflection showed a different woman than the young ballerina of 18 months ago. His eyes carried more depth, more history. That night, in his office, Daniel found himself again in front of the window that had become his secret portal to Gabriella's world. But the 40th floor remained empty and dark. A part of him missed those stolen moments. Mr. Kingston? Lawrence came in with a folder. Initial reports from the rehabilitation program have arrived. Daniel flipped through the pages until he found Gabriella's name. Preliminary assessments were promising but indicated a long road ahead. His eyes lingered on an observation from the physiotherapist. Shows exceptional determination, but tendency to exceed physical limits. Without thinking twice, Daniel grabbed his phone. Claire, Daniel Kingston, about Gabriella Moreno. Is she taking care of herself properly? The concern in his voice surprised even himself. On the other end of the line, Claire smiled. Mr. Kingston, she is progressing well, but perhaps she could use an occasional reminder that she doesn't have to carry the world alone. That same night, Gabriella received an unexpected delivery at her new apartment. A basket of therapeutic bath salts, a professional ice pack, and a simple card that simply said, "Take care of yourself, DK." The gesture took her by surprise. In all his interactions with Daniel Kingston, he had appeared formal and controlled. This small act of kindness revealed a different side of the businessman who everyone described as cold and calculating. Miguel found his sister contemplating the card with a soft smile. "So," he teased, "is this the famous Mr. Kingston?" "It's nothing like that," Gabriella replied quickly, but her blush betrayed her. "He's just different than what people say." "Different how?" Miguel insisted, sitting next to her. Gabriella thought for a moment. "As someone who understands what it's like to lose something precious and be afraid to dream again." The next morning, during her physical therapy session, Gabriella was surprised to see Daniel Kingston appear in the studio. He looked out of place in his impeccable suit among the mirrors and ballet bars. "Just a routine visit to check on the program," he explained, but his eyes met hers through the mirror with an intensity that made her heart race. Claire watched the interaction with interest. "Mr. Kingston, while you're here, would you like to see some of the exercises Gabriella has been doing?" Before Daniel could respond, Gabriella was already at the bar, executing a series of basic movements with a grace that, even limited by her injury, was mesmerizing. It was different from her nightly office dances. Here she was completely aware of her audience, especially the pair of blue eyes that never left hers. "Impressive," Daniel murmured, his voice huskier than usual. Gabriella smiled, feeling something awaken in her chest, something that had nothing to do with ballet and everything to do with the man who had given her back her dreams, only to begin to be a part of them. Gabriella dove into the routine of the rehabilitation program with a determination that impressed even Claire. Mornings began with strengthening exercises, followed by physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted but strangely invigorated. It was a different pain than the one he had carried for the past 18 months, a pain with purpose. During a particularly challenging session, Claire noticed something different about her posture. "You're smiling while you're doing the exercises," the physiotherapist observed. "This is the first time I've seen this." "It's because there is hope now," Gabriella replied, adjusting her position on the bar. His eyes inevitably wandered to the studio window, where he could see the Kingston Tower in the distance, silhouetted imposingly against the Chicago sky. Daniel, in turn, found himself increasingly distracted in his meetings. Lawrence had noticed how his boss always found an excuse to stop by the rehab center during his visits to other projects. That afternoon, after a meeting with investors near the site, Daniel decided to make another one of his routine visits. "Mr. Kingston," Claire greeted him with a knowing smile. "What a coincidence. Gabriella just mastered a particularly challenging sequence." Daniel's face lit up in a way that made Lawrence, who was with him, raise his eyebrows in surprise. His boss rarely showed this much enthusiasm for anything that didn't involve numbers and contracts. In the main studio, Gabriella was so focused on her sequence that she didn't immediately notice Daniel's presence. Her movements were fluid yet cautious, and there was a new confidence in her expression that left him breathless. "Impressive," he said, making her turn around quickly. "Mr. Kingston." Gabriella blushed, quickly lowering her leg from the bar. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Daniel," he corrected softly. "I think after all those nights watching me dance, we can use first names," she joked, surprising herself with her boldness. A genuine smile lit up his face. "Fair enough, although I was more of an uninvited spectator." Claire and Lawrence exchanged meaningful glances before discreetly leaving the studio, giving the two some privacy. "How's your brother?" Daniel asked, approaching as Gabriella began to stretch. "Adjusting well to the new apartment. He says he can finally study without hearing the neighbors fight," she smiled, but then her face became serious. "Daniel, I never properly thanked you for all of this." "No need," he replied quickly, but she shook her head. "Yes, there is. Not only did you give me my dance back, but you also gave Miguel a real chance to achieve his dream." She hesitated before continuing. May I ask why you really did that? The truth this time? Daniel remained silent for a moment, watching his reflection in the studio mirror. My mother was a great patron of the arts, he began, his voice soft. She always said I spent too much time building walls and not enough building bridges. And what happened to her? Gabriella asked gently, although she already knew the answer through internet research. Helicopter crash. Her and my dad 5 years ago. His voice was controlled, but Gabriella could see the pain in his eyes. After that, I got lost in business. It was easier to deal with numbers than people. Until you see someone dancing alone in the dark, she suggested softly. Until I saw someone who, despite having lost everything, still found reasons to dance, he corrected, his eyes meeting hers through the mirror. The moment was interrupted by Claire's return. Sorry, but Gabriella has one more set of exercises to complete today. Daniel nodded, regaining his professional composure. Of course, I don't want to hinder your recovery. You never get in the way, Gabriella said softly, before she could stop herself. That night, in her new apartment, Gabriella found another unexpected gift. A pair of professional custom-made flats with a note that said, "For when you're ready to dance under the lights again. Daniel." Miguel found his sister crying silently over her sneakers. Are you okay? He asked worriedly. I'm fine, she replied, wiping away her tears. It's just, sometimes people's kindness catches you off guard, you know? Kindness, or something more? Miguel teased, earning a pillow from his sister. At Kingston Tower, Daniel stayed in his office late as usual, but now, when he looked up at the 40th floor through the reflection of the windows, it was no longer just the memory of a dance that kept him there. It was the promise of what could be, of a future that, for the first time in 5 years, seemed to glow with possibilities beyond the walls he had built around himself. Lawrence found his boss smiling at the bright city. The merger reports are ready for your review, sir. Leave it until tomorrow, Lawrence, Daniel replied, surprising his assistant. Some things are more important than numbers. The news of Gabriella's exceptional progress in the rehabilitation program circulated through the halls of Chicago City Ballet like a hopeful whisper. In just a few weeks, she had surpassed Claire's initial expectations, although she was still far from her former self. During a particularly cold December morning, Gabriella found an envelope in her locker at the rehab center. Inside were 2 tickets to The Nutcracker at the Auditorium Theater, accompanied by a handwritten note. Sometimes we need to remember why we started. Daniel. The performance would be that night. Gabriella felt her heart quicken as she realized it would be the first time she had returned to the theater since her injury. Miguel was busy with an important college project, so she would have to face that emotionally charged moment alone. Not exactly alone, she murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the letters of Daniel's note. At Kingston Tower, Daniel tried to focus on a video conference with investors from Seattle, but his thoughts kept wandering to that night. Lawrence watched his boss with a mixture of amusement and concern. He had never seen Daniel Kingston so distracted. Sir, Lawrence interrupted after the call, shall I cancel your dinner with the council tonight? Why would you do that? Daniel asked, even though he already knew the answer. Because you clearly have other plans, Lawrence replied with a discreet smile, indicating the tickets on the table. Daniel adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that surprised even himself. It's just a follow-up to the rehabilitation program, he explained, without convincing anyone. At 7 in the evening, Gabriella found Daniel waiting at the entrance to the theater. He had exchanged his usual business suit for an elegant tuxedo that made him look even more imposing. For a moment, she felt inadequate in her simple black dress, until she noticed the look of admiration in his eyes. You look stunning, Daniel said softly, offering his arm. The theater was packed, but their seats were perfect, a private area with a privileged view of the stage. When the lights dimmed and the first notes of the opening filled the room, Gabriella felt tears form in her eyes. Daniel noticed her emotion and, in an instinctive gesture, covered her hand with his. The contact was soft, but full of understanding. Gabriella didn't remove her hand. During the break, they remained in their seats, talking about dance techniques and memories. Daniel revealed that his mother took him to see The Nutcracker every year at Christmas. "It was the only time I saw her cry," he confessed. "During the sugar dance. She said some things are too beautiful not to move us." Gabriella studied him in the softly lit room. "You miss her so much." It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. "Every day. She would have loved to meet you." The intimate moment was interrupted by the bell announcing the return of the break. During the second act, Gabriella realized that she was observing the dance in a different way, no longer with envy or sadness, but with a new understanding of her own journey. After the show, Daniel suggested a coffee in a small bistro near the theater. The place was cozy, with soft lighting and jazz music in the background. "How was it?" he asked, watching her over his cup of coffee. "Back to the theater?" Gabriella considered the question for a moment. "Different than I expected. Less painful. It's like visiting the house you grew up in after a long time. The memories are there, but you're not the same person anymore." "And is that good or bad?" "Both, I think," she smiled. "But mostly good. Especially having someone who understands by my side." The comment caught Daniel by surprise, making him momentarily lower his guard. "I understand more than you know," he said softly. "About losing dreams?" Gabriella asked. "About finding new ones," he corrected, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the air between them feel electrified. The moment was interrupted by Gabriella's cell phone, a message from Miguel asking if everything was okay. She responded quickly, but the spell of the night had been broken. Daniel drove her home in his car, the silence between them comfortable and charged with unspoken possibilities. When they stopped in front of her building, Gabriella hesitated before leaving. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for tonight, but for helping me rediscover dance in a new way." "Gabriella," Daniel called when she was already on the sidewalk. "Do you still dance on the 40th floor sometimes?" She smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face. "No, now I dance under the lights, like you said I would." That night, as Daniel watched the city from his penthouse apartment, he realized that something fundamental had changed. Kingston Tower, which for so long had been merely a monument to his business success, now held something far more precious. The beginning of a story he had not planned, but which was quickly becoming the most important of his life. Chicago's first snow day brought new energy to the rehabilitation center. Gabriella watched the white flakes through the studio window as she performed her morning exercises, her body responding better and better to the intensive training. "Her center of gravity has improved considerably," Claire commented, adjusting Gabriella's posture during a modified pirouette. "But I still notice some hesitation before the more complex movements." "It's psychological," Gabriella admitted, remembering the exact moment her knee gave way during that fateful performance of Swan Lake. "Sometimes, when I'm about to perform certain steps, I relive that moment." Claire nodded understandingly. "That's why I called a special person to work with you today." As if on cue, the studio door opened, revealing a figure that took Gabriella's breath away. Victoria Chen, the legendary prima ballerina who had retired after a similar injury 10 years ago, only to become one of the country's most respected choreographers. "Miss Chen," Gabriella whispered, barely believing her eyes. "Please call me Victoria," the woman smiled, approaching with an elegance that the years had not diminished. "Daniel told me about you." The mention of his name made Gabriella's heart skip a beat. Since the night at the theater, their interactions had become more frequent, but always maintaining a fine line between professionalism and something deeper that neither of them dared to name. "Daniel?" Gabriella asked, curious about the familiarity with which Victoria referred to him. "Ah, yes," Victoria smiled knowingly. "Amanda Kingston, his mother, was my biggest supporter when I faced my own injury. Daniel is just continuing her legacy, although I suspect his motivations are a little different in your case. The blush on Gabriella's cheeks didn't go unnoticed by Claire, who discreetly left the studio, leaving the three women alone. Victoria began working with Gabriella, sharing not only physical techniques but also the emotional battles she faced on her own recovery journey. Fear, she explained, can be a teacher or a jailer. It's your choice. During the session, Victoria revealed how Amanda Kingston had created a similar rehabilitation program years ago, specifically to help her. Daniel was just a teenager at the time, but he already showed the same determination as his mother. After she left, he completely closed himself off from the world of art. Until now, Claire added softly, returning to the studio with bottles of water. The hours passed quickly, and when the session ended, Gabriella felt not only physically exhausted, but emotionally transformed. Victoria had given him much more than technical instructions. She had offered him a completely new perspective on his recovery. "Before you go," Victoria said, taking something from her bag, "I'd like you to have this." It was an old performance program, showing a young Victoria in Giselle. Turn the page. On the back cover was a photo of Victoria with Amanda Kingston, both smiling after what appeared to be a successful performance. Amanda always said that true art is not in perfection, but in the ability to transform limitations into new possibilities. That afternoon, as she prepared to leave the center, Gabriella found Daniel waiting in the lobby. He looked nervous, something rare in his usual controlled composure. "How was the session with Victoria?" he asked, his hands in his coat pockets in a gesture that betrayed his anxiety. "Amazing," Gabriella replied, showing him the program. "She told me about your mother." Daniel examined the photo with a soft expression that Gabriella rarely saw. Mom could always see the potential in people, even when they themselves couldn't. "How did you do to me?" Gabriella asked softly. The look Daniel gave him was full of emotion. "Gabriella, Mr. Kingston," Lawrence's voice echoed through the lobby. "Sorry to interrupt, but the conference with London starts in 15 minutes. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, clearly frustrated by the interruption. "I have to go," he said, handing the program back. "But would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? There's something I want to show you." Gabriella nodded, her heart racing at the intensity of his gaze. As she watched Daniel leave with Lawrence, Victoria silently approached. "You know," the former dancer said with a knowing smile, "in all the years since Amanda left, this is the first time I've seen that same sparkle in Daniel's eyes, the same one he had when he watched performances with his mother." That night in her apartment, Gabriella found Miguel studying at the kitchen table. "How was the session with the legendary Victoria Chen?" he asked, noticing the program in his hands. "Enlightening," she replied, sitting down next to her brother. "Miguel, can you believe that sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them? Like a certain CEO who works late to watch people dance?" he teased, earning a shy smile from his sister. "It's more complicated than that," Gabriella sighed, her fingers tracing the photo of Amanda and Victoria. "Sometimes it feels like there's a bigger story being written, you know? Something that started long before us." Miguel closed his anatomy book, watching his sister fondly. "Gabi, since you started this program, you look different. It's not just your knee that's healing." Her brother's words echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed, Victoria's program neatly tucked away on her bedside table. Tomorrow would be another day of challenges and discoveries, but for the first time in a long time, Gabriella felt no fear of the future, just a sweet anticipation for what it might bring. The old abandoned theater on the corner of Wells Street was not the place Gabriella expected when Daniel invited her to dinner. The Art Deco building, with its weathered facade and faded posters, looked like a ghost from a more glamorous era in Chicago. "Trust me," Daniel said, noticing her hesitation as he opened a side door with an old-fashioned key. The interior was dark, but as soon as he flipped a switch, soft lights revealed a surprisingly well-preserved lobby. "This was my mother's favorite theater," he explained. guiding Gabriella through hallways decorated with old photographs. The Kingston Theater was where she saw her first ballet performance at age 7. It was also where she met my father, during an intermission of Romeo and Juliet. Gabriella stopped in front of one photograph in particular, a young Amanda Kingston, radiant in a white tutu. She also danced? It was your passion, Daniel replied, his voice soft with memories. But never professionally. The theater belonged to her family, and responsibilities ended up taking precedence over artistic dreams. They arrived at the main auditorium, where an elegantly set table awaited them in the center of the stage, lit by dozens of candles. The effect was magical. The lights danced on the ornate walls, creating shadows that seemed to tell stories of their own. Daniel, that's... Gabriella lost words, moved by the care and meaning of the moment. After my parents died, I closed this place down, he continued, pulling out a chair for her. I couldn't bear the memories, but when I saw you dancing that first night at the office, something changed. Dinner was served by a discreet buffet, elaborate dishes that would normally impress Gabriella, but she barely registered, so absorbed was she in the story Daniel was sharing. Kingston Enterprises started here, you know, he commented between bites. My father convinced investors during breaks between presentations. Mom always said that art and business didn't have to be enemies. What now? Gabriella asked softly. What do you plan to do with this place? Daniel hesitated, his eyes meeting hers through the candlelight. That's a bit up to you, actually. Before she could elaborate, music began to play softly. The first notes of Swan Lake, the same piece during which Gabriella had injured herself. Dance with me? Daniel asked, extending his hand. I don't know if I can, she replied, her knees suddenly feeling heavier. Not as a ballerina, he clarified. Just like Gabriella. The simplicity of the request disarmed her. Accepting his hand, Gabriella allowed herself to be guided to center stage. To her surprise, Daniel knew how to dance. Not ballet, but enough to lead her in smooth movements that respected her limitations. Victoria tells me you're progressing faster than expected, he commented as they slowly turned. There's still a long way to go, Gabriella replied, aware of the closeness between them. But for the first time since the accident, I feel like there is a way. That's why I want to reopen the theater, Daniel revealed. Not just as a performance space, but as an extension of the rehabilitation program. A place where recovering artists can perform without fear, adapt their techniques, rediscover their art. Gabriella stopped dancing, looking at him with a mixture of surprise and excitement. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to be a part of this, he replied, his voice huskier than usual. Not just as a dancer, but as artistic director. Victoria has already agreed to be a consultant and... Daniel, she interrupted him softly. Why are you really doing all this? The silence that followed was filled with unresolved tension. Daniel brought a hand to her face, a gesture so gentle it made Gabriella catch her breath. Because when I saw you dancing that first night, I realized I had spent the last 5 years just existing, he confessed. You reminded me what it's like to feel passionate about something, what it's like to see beauty even in broken things. I'm not broken, Gabriella said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. No, it's not, he agreed with a soft smile. It's turning into something even more extraordinary. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of thunder. A winter storm was approaching. But neither of them moved, trapped in an instant that seemed suspended in time. I need to think about your proposal, Gabriella finally said, aware of how such a decision could change her life. Of course, Daniel replied, although his eyes said there was much more at stake than just a professional proposal. When the night ended and Daniel took her home, the snow was beginning to fall again over Chicago. In the car, Gabriella held a small framed program that Daniel had given her. Amanda Kingston's last performance at the theater, 30 years ago. She would have loved to see this place come to life again, Daniel commented softly, especially through someone who understands that art isn't just about perfection. Gabriella looked at him, realizing that perhaps she wasn't the only one who was learning to dance in a new way. Daniel Kingston was also relearning how to move through the world, abandoning the rigid steps he had imposed on himself after the loss of his parents. That night, as the snow covered Chicago with its blanket of white, two souls began to understand that sometimes the best pas de deux are the ones that don't follow an established choreography. The dance studio was buzzing with a different energy that morning. Victoria Chen had organized a special performance for participants in the rehabilitation program, and Gabriella felt her stomach churn with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. It was the first time I had danced in front of an audience since the accident, even if it was just a small group of colleagues and instructors. "Remember," Victoria whispered as she helped Gabriella warm up, "today is not about technical perfection. It's about rediscovering your voice through movement." Claire watched intently from across the studio, taking notes on her clipboard as Gabriella performed her warm-up sequence. Progress over the past few weeks had been remarkable, but there were still moments of hesitation, especially before more complex moves. "Daniel confirmed attendance?" Claire asked casually, although her smile suggested the question was anything but casual. Gabriella felt her face heat up. Since that night at the Kingston Theater, something had changed between them. The daily text messages, the accidental coffees after her physical therapy sessions, the glances that lasted a second longer than necessary. Everything pointed to a different dance than what happened in the studio. "He has an important meeting today," Gabriella replied, ignoring the tightness in her chest. Daniel's proposal to reopen the theater still echoed in his mind, along with all the unspoken implications that came with it. Victoria brought together all participants for a brief group warm-up. Among them was Marcus, a former dancer with the San Francisco company who had suffered an injury similar to Gabriella's. His eyes met hers with understanding. They both knew the weight of broken dreams. "Each of you has prepared a piece that represents your journey so far," Victoria announced. "We are not looking for perfect technique, but emotional honesty." The presentation began. One by one, the dancers shared their interpretations of loss and rebirth through movement. Gabriella watched, absorbing each story told without words, each gesture loaded with meaning. When it was her turn, Gabriella took a deep breath. She had chosen a modified variation of Giselle, not the version she used to dance, but a reinterpretation that incorporated her new limitations as an integral part of the choreography. The music began, soft and melancholy. His first movements were restrained, almost hesitant, reflecting the months since his injury. Gradually, the dance evolved, becoming more confident, more expansive. Where there were once limitations, there were now creative adaptations. It was in the middle of a particularly challenging sequence that she saw him. Daniel was standing discreetly near the studio entrance, still in his business suit. Their eyes met through the mirror, and in that moment, something clicked inside her. The dance has changed. It was no longer just about her journey to recovery, but about all the possibilities that opened up in front of her. Each movement told a story of transformation, not just of the body, but of the soul. When the song ended, the silence in the studio was palpable. Victoria was the first to applaud, followed by the rest of the group. Gabriella barely registered the applause, her eyes still locked on Daniel's. "Extraordinary," Victoria commented, moving closer. "You've found your new voice." The group took a break for a snack, and Gabriella took advantage of the moment to approach Daniel, who remained near the entrance. "I thought I had an important meeting," she said softly. "I did," he replied, his eyes shining. "But some things are more important than mergers and acquisitions." "Like seeing an ex-cleaner dance?" she teased, even though her heart was beating faster. "Like seeing someone who taught me how to dream again," he corrected, his voice low and intense. The moment was interrupted by Victoria, who approached with a knowing smile. "Daniel, I'm glad you came. I was just telling Gabriella how perfect your performance would be for the opening of the theater." Gabriella held her breath. He had not yet given his answer about the theater's proposal, although his heart already knew the decision. "Actually," she began, gathering her courage, "I've been thinking about this, about the theater, about the program." "And?" Daniel asked, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "And I think your mother was right," Gabriella continued. "Art and business don't have to be enemies. But I need to know something first." "What?" "If that," she gestured between them, "is part of the equation. Because if it is, we need to be honest about it, with ourselves and with everyone involved in the project." Daniel was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the studio where other dancers continued to share their stories. "When I first saw you dancing in the office, something woke up in me," he finally said. "It wasn't just about dance, it was about life, about possibilities, about letting the past be a teacher, not a prison." Victoria discreetly walked away, leaving them alone with the weight of those words. "So?" Gabriella asked softly. "So," Daniel replied, a smile forming on his lips, "I think it's time we start our own choreography." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of emotions and planning. Between performances and conversations, Gabriella felt something solidify in her chest, a certainty that sometimes the best dance moves are the ones that take us in unexpected directions. News of the Kingston Theater's reopening spread quickly through Chicago art circles. Daniel had organized a press conference in the theater's restored lobby, where Victoria Chen officially announced her participation as artistic advisor for the expanded rehabilitation program. Gabriella watched from the side of the stage, still adjusting to her new role as artistic director. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and changes. Between physical therapy sessions, planning meetings, and program development, he barely had time to process the transformation in his life. "Nervous?" Daniel's soft voice surprised her. He had approached silently, as he always did when he found her lost in thought. "A little," she admitted, unconsciously adjusting her posture. "It's different being on this side of the stage." "Different good or different bad?" he asked, his fingers lightly brushing hers, a gesture that had become frequent between them. "Different, right," she replied, smiling when she saw Miguel among those present. His brother had made a point of being there, even in the middle of college finals. The press conference went smoothly, with Victoria commanding media attention with her magnetic presence. When it was time for questions, a young reporter raised his hand. "Mr. Kingston, does this dramatic change in the direction of Kingston Enterprises have anything to do with your mother's legacy?" The silence that followed was tense. Gabriella felt Daniel stiffen beside her, their hands instinctively finding themselves under the protection of the presentation table. "My mother," Daniel began, his voice firm but soft, "has always believed that art has the power to heal not just individuals, but entire communities. This project is as much about honoring her legacy as it is about creating something new." After the press conference, as the journalists dispersed, Claire appeared with the latest progress reports on the program. "The results are impressive," she commented, handing the folder to Gabriella. "Especially yours." Daniel watched the interaction with interest, noting how Gabriella immediately began leafing through the documents. "Any prediction for when she might—" "Daniel," Gabriella interrupted him gently. "Remember what we talked about patience?" He smiled, remembering the promise he had made not to put pressure on his recovery. It was difficult for someone used to controlling everything in their life to accept that some processes had their own time. Victoria approached the group, her eyes shining with excitement. "The theater needs a special inaugural performance," she declared, "something that symbolizes not just rebirth, but transformation." "I have an idea," Gabriella said, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "What if we created an original piece? Something that incorporated the stories of all dancers in recovery?" The suggestion provoked a flurry of lively discussion. Soon plans began to form, a production that would blend classical elements with adapted contemporary choreography, allowing each dancer to shine within their own capabilities. Later that night, after everyone had left, Daniel found Gabriella alone on stage, experimenting with gentle movements under the low lights. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. "Old habits," she smiled, holding out her hand to him. "Dance with me?" It was different from her dancing in the empty theater weeks ago. Now there was a familiarity in their movements, a mutual trust that went beyond the rehearsed steps. "I got an interesting connection today," Daniel commented as he guided her in a gentle spin. "The Chicago Tribune wants to do a story on us." "About the theater?" Gabriella asked, even though she knew the answer. "About everything," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "The program, the theater, us." Gabriella stopped dancing but kept her hands in his. "And how do you feel about that?" "Honest?" Daniel sighed, terrified, not because of what they'll say about me, but because it means making this real. He gestured between them. Not just for Chicago, but for ourselves. Gabriella understood perfectly. In recent weeks, they had carefully navigated their growing closeness, aware of the complications their relationship could bring to the project. "Real doesn't mean wrong," she said softly, remembering Victoria's words about turning limitations into possibilities. "No," Daniel agreed, his hand stroking her face. "Real means I'm no longer just watching you dance through reflections in windows. It means I'm here, really here, for the first time in years." The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, like the first steps of a new dance. When they separated, Gabriella saw the same sparkle in Daniel's eyes that Victoria had mentioned, the one he shared with his mother when it came to art and passion. "So," she whispered, "what's our next move?" "Together," he replied simply, pulling her back into his arms as the distant music from the theater's sound system continued to play, lulling two hearts that had finally found their common rhythm. The first snow of January blanketed Chicago as rehearsals for the Kingston Theater's inaugural performance officially began. Gabriella watched from the mezzanine as Victoria led the warm-up with the group of dancers, each of them carrying their own story of overcoming. "Nervous?" Miguel asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. He had begun spending more time at the theater between his college classes, fascinated by his sister's transformation. "Anxious," Gabriella corrected, accepting the coffee. "It's different being on this side of choreography. Every decision I make affects not just my dancing, but everyone's." On stage, Marcus performed a particularly challenging sequence that he and Gabriella had developed together, adapting classic moves to accommodate his limitations. It was impressive to see how something that had started as a necessity was transforming into a new form of artistic expression. "Miss Moreno," Lawrence called discreetly, "Mr. Kingston would like to see you in his office when possible." Daniel's new office at the theater was a curious mix of present and past, modern furniture contrasting with old photographs of the performances his mother had organized. Gabriella found him focused on some documents, his expression worried. "Did something happen?" she asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "The Chicago Tribune ran the story," Daniel replied, sliding the magazine across the table. On the cover, a photo of them dancing in the empty theater, captured during a private rehearsal. The title read, "From the Top to the Stage, the novel that's revolutionizing the arts in Chicago." Gabriella sat, absorbing the implications. While their relationship wasn't exactly a secret, seeing it exposed like this was different. "How are you dealing with this?" "Honestly," Daniel stood up, walking towards her, "I'm more concerned about how this will affect you and the program. I've already had 3 calls from the board, asking if I'm letting emotions get in the way of business." "And they are?" she asked softly, meeting his eyes. "Yes," he admitted with a small smile. "And for the first time in my life, I don't care about that." The moment was interrupted by Victoria, who entered without knocking, a habit she had developed since taking on her role as a consultant. "Sorry, but we need you two at rehearsal. We have a little creative challenge." On stage, two dancers were discussing the interpretation of a sequence. The new style of choreography, which mixed classical techniques with modern adaptations, sometimes generated artistic conflicts. "Jason, Anna," Gabriella called, her voice firm but gentle. "Show me what you're trying to do." The dancers demonstrated the sequence, and Gabriella immediately identified the problem. It was the same kind of hesitation she herself had faced, the fear of trusting a body that had once betrayed her. "You guys are thinking too much," she explained, moving to center stage. "Watch." With Daniel as her impromptu partner, Gabriella demonstrated a modified version of the sequence. It wasn't technically perfect, but there was a natural fluidity, an acceptance of limitations that made the movement more authentic. "See?" Victoria commented, approaching. "It's not about recreating what was before. It's about discovering a new way to tell the story." The rest of the rehearsal flowed more smoothly. Gabriella alternated between dancing and directing, finding a delicate balance between her multiple roles. Daniel remained nearby, offering silent support and occasionally participating in demonstrations. "You look different," Claire observed during a pause, adjusting Gabriella's knee after a particularly intense sequence. "Like this?" "Lighter," the physiotherapist explained, as if he had finally found his center of gravity. Gabriella looked at Daniel, who was talking animatedly with Miguel about the technical aspects of lighting. "Maybe I have," she smiled. As the afternoon progressed, the rehearsal turned into a story-sharing session. Each dancer contributed elements of their own journey to the larger narrative they were building. "That's it," Victoria suddenly exclaimed. "This is how we're going to open the show, with each of you emerging from the shadows, bringing your own light." The idea quickly came to life, with the dancers experimenting with different ways of incorporating their individual stories into the collective choreography. It was fascinating to see how his limitations, instead of restricting the dance, were creating a new language of movement. When rehearsal finally ended, Gabriella found Daniel waiting for her backstage. "Dinner?" he asked, but something in his expression suggested there was more to the proposal. "I have a better idea," she replied, taking his hand. "Come with me." Gabriella guided him to the 40th floor of the Kingston Tower, now empty and silent in the Chicago twilight. "Why are we here?" Daniel asked, although his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Because this is where it all started," she explained, removing her flats from her bag. "And sometimes we need to go back to the beginning to understand where we're going." As Gabriella danced in the family space, Daniel watched no longer through reflections and windows, but directly, completely present in the moment. Her dance was different now, no longer an expression of loss and loneliness, but a celebration of transformation and possibility. "Dance with me," she called, holding out her hand to him. And there, in the same place where their stories had first intertwined, they created a new memory, a new dance that spoke not just of overcoming, but of encounter, of two souls learning to move together in perfect synchrony. The media buzz surrounding the Kingston Theater grew as the date of the inaugural performance approached. Chicago Arts Magazine had published an extensive report on the rehabilitation program, highlighting how the initiative was redefining the limits of classical dance. Daniel found Gabriella in her office at the theater, immersed in choreography notes. The way she lightly bit her lower lip as she concentrated made him smile. It was the same gesture he had noticed those first few nights, watching her through the windows of Kingston Tower. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, placing a cup of tea next to her. "I'm worried about Anna," Gabriella replied, pointing to a video of the rehearsal on her laptop. "She had a relapse yesterday. Claire says it's nothing serious, but you see yourself in her," Daniel added, understanding immediately. Anna was a former Boston ballet dancer who had suffered a similar injury to Gabriella. "It's frustrating to see someone facing the same fears," she sighed, leaning back in her chair, "especially when I know exactly how to overcome them, but I can't just transfer that experience to her." Victoria chose this moment to enter, carrying a pile of vintage costumes. "Look what I found in the theater archives," he exclaimed excitedly. These were from the last production Amanda directed. Daniel picked up one of the dresses carefully, his fingers tracing the delicate embroidery. I remember this one. Mom spent weeks overseeing every detail. And now we're going to give them new life. Victoria smiled, watching as Gabriella was already beginning to examine the pieces with a critical eye. With some adaptations, of course. The sound of music coming from the stage interrupted the conversation. It was Marcus, rehearsing his solo sequence alone. The three watched in silence through the office door as he transformed his limitations into a new form of expression. "That's it," Gabriella suddenly exclaimed, her eyes shining with inspiration. "This is how we can help Anna. Not by showing the way, but by letting her find her own voice." Daniel watched in amazement as Gabriella quickly sketched out a new choreographic sequence, her hands moving with the same grace her feet used to have. Victoria moved closer, occasionally suggesting adjustments, while the vintage dresses waited patiently to be reinvented. "You look different," Lawrence commented later, when he found Daniel reviewing the final details of the contract with the lighting company. "Like this? More present." The assistant chose the word carefully. "Before it was like you were operating on automatic. Now there's a different energy." Daniel pondered this as he watched through his office window. On stage, Gabriella worked with Anna, not demonstrating movements, but guiding the young dancer to discover her own possibilities. "You know, Lawrence," he began, "I spent 5 years building walls around myself after losing my parents. I thought success in business would be enough. And it wasn't? It was like dancing looking only at your feet." Daniel smiled, remembering the words Gabriella had used during one of her rehearsals. "You do the steps perfectly, but you miss the whole song." The afternoon progressed with renewed energy in the theater. Miguel appeared after his classes, bringing coffee for everyone and taking the opportunity to study anatomy by watching the dancers. His constant presence had become an integral part of the environment, and his medical perspective often offered valuable insights into the dancers' limitations and possibilities. "How's the knee?" he asked his sister during a pause, his professional gaze assessing her movements. "Different," Gabriella answered honestly. "Not better or worse, just different. Like he's found a new way to express himself." Claire, who was passing by, smiled when she heard the comment. "That's exactly the mindset we're trying to cultivate in the program. It's not about going back to the way things were, but about discovering new possibilities." The rehearsal continued until dusk, with each dancer contributing to the evolution of the choreography. Victoria watched with satisfaction as the collaborative spirit had transformed what had started as a rehabilitation program into something much larger. "Amanda would be proud," she told Daniel as they watched the dancers say goodbye. "Not just the theater, but you." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "Sometimes I wonder if she would approve of all these changes." "Daniel," Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder, "your mother always said art is about transformation. Look at what you and Gabriella have created here. It's not just a rehabilitation program. It's a renewal movement." Later, when the theater was almost empty, Daniel found Gabriella in his mother's old dressing room, now transformed into a small rehearsal studio. She was trying on one of the vintage dresses, making small mental adjustments. "It suits you," he said softly, moving closer. "Are you sure you don't mind us changing them?" "I'm sure that's exactly what Mom would like," he replied, hugging her from behind as they both looked at themselves in the antique mirror. "She always said that tradition without evolution is stagnation." Gabriella turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "Speaking of evolution, Victoria told me about the National Dance Foundation's proposal to expand the program to other cities. And what do you think?" Daniel asked, although he already knew the answer by the sparkle in her eyes. "I think we have a lot of work to do," she smiled, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. The week leading up to the Kingston Theater's opening transformed the venue into a whirlwind of frenetic activity. Gabriella watched from the mezzanine as the technical team adjusted the last lights, tested the sound, and finalized the details of the set. The theater had become a second home for everyone involved in the project, every corner echoing with stories of overcoming and renewal. "Tickets are sold out," Lawrence reported, approaching with his clipboard ever present. "And the waiting list continues to grow, including 3 artistic directors from other companies," Victoria added, joining them. "Our little experiment is getting more attention than we expected." Gabriella felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. It wasn't just about a dance performance. It was about proving that physical limitations did not define the end of an artistic career, only its transformation. On stage, Anna rehearsed her new sequence, her movements flowing with a confidence that wasn't there just a few weeks ago. The young dancer had found her own voice after that moment of crisis, transforming her restrictions into a new form of expression. "You did it," Daniel said softly, his presence a comforting constant at Gabriella's side. "You showed them all, that there is life beyond limitations." "We did it," she corrected, lacing her fingers through his. "Every person in this theater contributed to this transformation." Claire showed up with the dancers' latest medical reports. "Everyone is ready to report," she announced, but her gaze lingered on Gabriella, "including you, if you still want to participate in that final sequence." Gabriella's decision to dance at the premiere had sparked heated debate. Miguel, in particular, had expressed concern about the impact on his long-term recovery. But after extensive consultations with Claire and the medical team, a compromise had been reached. A brief but meaningful appearance at the end of the show. "It's important," Gabriella explained during the dress rehearsal, bringing together the entire cast. "Not because I need to prove anything to anyone, but because it represents our collective journey. Each of us has faced moments when we thought we would never dance again." Marcus, who had become a pillar of support for the other dancers, nodded in understanding. "It's about showing that art doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful." The afternoon progressed with the final costume adjustments. Victoria had personally overseen the tailoring of Amanda Kingston's vintage dresses, preserving their essence while making them functional for each dancer's specific needs. "I found this among her belongings," Daniel said later, handing Gabriella a small antique music box. "Mom used it to focus before every performance she directed." Gabriella delicately opened the box, letting Tchaikovsky's gentle melody fill the dressing room. "It's perfect," she whispered, already visualizing how she could incorporate that element into the show. Miguel arrived at the end of the rehearsal, bringing with him not only his usual fraternal support, but also a surprise. He had managed to contact some of his former medical professors interested in studying the impact of the rehabilitation program on the recovery of injuries in dancers. "Imagine," he said excitedly, "combining medical research with art. We could help even more people." The idea quickly gained traction. Daniel was already envisioning the possibilities for expanding the program, while Victoria considered the artistic implications of closer collaboration with the medical community. On the eve of the premiere, after everyone had left, Gabriella found herself alone on the stage of the Kingston Theater. The service lights created soft shadows that danced across the ornate walls, reminding her of those lonely nights on the 40th floor. "I thought I'd find you here," Daniel's voice echoed through the empty theater. He had removed his tie and jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a very different image from the ruthless CEO he used to be. "Just saying goodbye," she explained, gesturing to the space around her. "Firing? That Gabriella who danced alone in the dark," she elaborated. "Starting tomorrow, everything changes." Daniel walked over, taking your hands in his. "Change doesn't always mean loss," he reminded her softly. "Sometimes it means discovering new dance moves." As if responding to a silent command, Amanda's little music box began to play backstage. Victoria had probably left it on. The familiar melody filled the theater, enveloping them in its nostalgic charm. "Dance with me?" Daniel asked. But this time was different from all the other times. There was a certainty in his movements, an unspoken promise in each step. As they danced in the soft light, Gabriella realized she had found something far more precious than her former ballet career. She had found a new way to fly, not in spite of her limitations, but through them. And there, on the eve of a reborn dream, two hearts beat in perfect synchronization, ready to take the next step in their own private dance. The Kingston Theater glowed against the Chicago night sky, its newly restored lights drawing a line that stretched 2 blocks. Local press crowded the entrance, cameras clicking as celebrities from the dance world, art critics and prominent society figures arrived for the grand opening. Backstage, Gabriella adjusted Amanda Kingston's vintage dress, now delicately adapted to her needs. Victoria moved between the dressing rooms, offering words of encouragement to each dancer. The nervousness was palpable, but there was also an electric energy of anticipation. "How's the knee?" Miguel asked, entering the dressing room after finishing his pre-show rounds with Claire, checking out each dancer. "There," Gabriella replied with a serene smile. "For the first time in a long time, really ready." Daniel found her moments later, looking more nervous than she herself. "Crowded theater," he reported, unconsciously adjusting his tie, including some representatives from the National Dance Foundation. "Hey," Gabriella held her fidgeting hands. "Breathe. Tonight isn't about them. It's about us. All of us." On stage, the technical team made the final adjustments. Amanda's music box had been incorporated into the show in a unique way. Its delicate sound would open each act, a subtle homage to the woman who had dreamed of a living theater of possibilities. Lawrence coordinated the final details of the production with impressive efficiency, having discovered an unexpected talent for artistic management. 5 minutes, his voice echoed through the corridors. Anna, who would open the show, was breathing deeply in her dressing room. Gabriella moved closer, recognizing the same look she used to see in her own reflection. "Remember," she said softly, "it's not about being perfect. It's about being true." The lights in the audience began to dim. In the orchestra pit, the musicians tuned their instruments one last time. Daniel found his seat in the front row, alongside Victoria and the Kingston Enterprises board members who, initially skeptical, had been won over by the project's vision. The curtain opened onto a seemingly empty stage. Then, the music box began its gentle melody, and one by one, figures emerged from the shadows, each dancer bringing their own light, their own story. Anna began her sequence with a confidence that moved Gabriella, watching from the sidelines. The show unfolded like a moving poem, each act telling a story of loss, acceptance, and rebirth. Marcus performed his solo sequence with an intensity that drew gasps from the audience. Amanda's vintage dresses seemed to take on a life of their own under the lights, each movement revealing new details of the delicate tailoring work. Backstage, Claire and Miguel monitored each dancer, ready for any eventuality. But their services were not needed. Each artist had learned to respect their limits while exploring new possibilities. The moment everyone was waiting for arrived in the final act. Gabriella emerged on stage not as a shadow of her former self, but as something entirely new. Her dance was a celebration of transformation, each movement telling the story of not just her personal journey, but of everyone who had found a new voice through the program. Daniel watched mesmerized, remembering that first night when he saw her dancing alone on the 40th floor. The woman on stage now radiated a different confidence, a grace that came not from technical perfection, but from the authenticity of her expression. The grand finale brought all the dancers together in a choreography that celebrated their differences as much as their similarities. The music from Amanda's music box intertwined with the orchestra, creating a soundscape that seemed to embrace each individual story into a larger narrative. When the last notes faded and the lights went out, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, like a wave, the audience rose to their feet in a thunderous ovation. Tears flowed freely, on the faces of the dancers, the audience, and especially in the eyes of Daniel, who had never felt his mother's presence so strongly as he did at that moment. During the greetings, each dancer had their moment of individual recognition. When Gabriella bowed, The theater erupted in renewed applause. Victoria, beside Daniel, shook his hand in silent understanding. They both knew they were witnessing not just the success of a show, but the birth of something revolutionary in the world of dance. The celebration continued into the night. Critics approached the dancers with enthusiastic questions about the program. Representatives from other companies were already discussing collaboration possibilities. Miguel circulated with a team of medical researchers, explaining the therapeutic implications of the program. In a quiet moment, Gabriela found Daniel in her mother's old dressing room, now transformed into a small museum with photographs and memories of the theater. The music box played softly in the background. "She would be proud," Gabriela said softly, looking at a photo of a young Amanda on the same stage they had just occupied. "From all of us," Daniel added, pulling her into his arms. "You know, I spent years trying to honor her legacy through numbers and contracts. I never realized that her true legacy was in her ability to transform lives through art." "What now?" Gabriela asked, her eyes meeting his through the vintage mirror. "Now," he smiled, "we keep dancing, together." Outside the theater, Chicago continued its own nightly dance of light and shadow. But inside the Kingston Theater, something magical had happened. Dreams had been redefined, limitations transformed into possibilities, and two souls had found their own music in the symphony of life. The music box continued its gentle melody, lulling the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Gabriela and Daniel, but for all those who would dare to dream beyond their limitations, finding beauty in imperfections and strength in vulnerability.